The heart is the most misperceived of our organs. For a start, it looks nothing like the traditional symbol associated with love. Nor is the heart where people place their right hand during patriotic moments. It is more centrally located in the chest than that. Most curious of all is that we make it the emotional seat of our being, as when we declare that we love someone with all our heart or profess a broken heart when they abandon us. Don't misunderstand me. The heart is a wondrous organ and fully deserving of our praise and gratitude, but it is not invested even slightly in our emotional well-being. And that's a good thing. The heart has no time for distractions. It is the most single-minded thing within you. It has just one job to do, and it does it supremely well. It beats. Slightly more than once every second, about 100,000 times a day, as many as 3.5 billion times in a lifetime, it rhythmically pulses blood through your body. And for all it does, the heart is a surprisingly modest thing, weighing less than a pound. The two phases of a heartbeat are known as a systole when it pushes blood out into the body, and a diastole when it relaxes and refills. The difference between these two is your blood pressure. The two numbers in a blood pressure reading, let's say 120/80, simply measure the highest and lowest pressures of your blood vessels that they experience with each heartbeat. The first higher number is systolic pressure, and the second is diastolic. The number specifically measures how many millimeters of mercury is pushed up in a calibrated tool. Well into the 20th century, many medical authorities believed that higher blood pressure was a good thing because it indicated a vigorous flow. We know now, of course, that chronically elevated blood pressure very seriously raises the risk of heart attack or stroke. Heart disease now is such a common complaint that it is surprising to learn that it is largely a modern preoccupation. Until the 1940s, the focus of healthcare was with conquering infectious diseases like diphtheria, typhoid fever, and tuberculosis. Only after many of these were cleared out of the way did it become evident that we had another growing epidemic on our hands in the form of cardiovascular disease. The triggering event for public awareness seems to have been the death of President Franklin Delano Roosevelt. In early 1945, his blood pressure soared, and it was clear that it was not a sign of vigor, but quite the opposite. He died soon afterwards, aged just 63, and the world seemed to suddenly realize that heart disease had become serious and widespread, and that it was time to try to do something about it. The result was the celebrated Framingham heart study, conducted in the town of Framingham, Massachusetts, just west of Boston. Starting in the autumn of 1948, the Framingham study recruited 5,000 local adults and followed them carefully for the rest of their lives, and the study is now in its third generation of volunteers. The idea from the outset was to determine the factors that led some people to have heart problems and others to escape them. In fact, the term risk factor is said to have been coined in Framingham. The 20th century could be called the century of the heart, because no other area of medicine experienced a more rapid and revolutionary progress. In a single lifetime, we have gone from barely being able to touch a beating heart to operating on it routinely. As with any complicated and risky medical procedure, it took years of patient work by lots of people to perfect the techniques and devise the apparatus to make it all possible. Although some scientists had successes with open heart surgery, it fell to a surgeon in Minneapolis named Walton Lillehei to improve both the technology and the surgical techniques. The technique worked so well that Lillehei became widely known as the father of open heart surgery and enjoyed a great deal of acclaim and financial success. Although open heart surgery allowed surgeons to correct many faults they previously couldn't get at, it couldn't solve the problem of a heart that wouldn't beat right. That required the device now universally known as a pacemaker. In 1958, a Swedish engineer named Rune Elmqvist, working with a surgeon named Ake Senning, built a pair of experimental pacemakers. The first was inserted into the chest of Arne Larsson, a 43-year-old patient who was very near death from a heart arrhythmia as a result of a viral infection. The device failed just after a few hours, and a backup was inserted and lasted for 3 years, though it kept breaking down and the batteries had to be recharged every few hours. As technology improved, Larsson was routinely fitted with new pacemakers and lived another 43 years. When he died in 2002 at age 86, he was on his 26th pacemaker and had outlived both Senning and Elmqvist. The first pacemaker was about the size of a pack of cards, and today's are no larger than a US quarter and can last up to 10 years. The coronary bypass. That's where they take a healthy vein from a person's leg and transplant it to direct blood flow around a diseased artery. This was devised in 1967 by Rene Favallaro at the Cleveland Clinic in Ohio. Favallaro grew up poor in Argentina and became the first member of his family to attain a higher education. Upon becoming a doctor, he spent 12 years working among the poor and came to the United States in the 1960s to improve his skills. At the Cleveland Clinic, he was little more than a trainee at first, but quickly proved himself adept at heart surgery, and in 1967, he invented the bypass. It was a comparatively simple but an ingenious procedure, and it worked brilliantly. Favallaro's first patients, a man too ill to walk up a flight of stairs, recovered completely and lived another 30 years. The great dream, however, was to transplant a heart. To remove a beating heart, no matter how far gone the owner was in all other respects, was to risk prosecution for murder. One place where this law did not apply was South Africa. So in 1967, at exactly the same time that Rene Favallaro was performing bypass surgery in Cleveland, Christian Bernard, a surgeon in Cape Town, attracted far more of the world's attention by transplanting the heart of a young woman, fatally injured in a car accident, into the chest of a 54-year-old man named Louis Washkansky. It was hailed as a great medical breakthrough, though in fact Washkansky died just after 18 days. Barnard had much better luck with his second transplant patient, a retired dentist named Philip Bleiberg, who survived for 19 months. Following Barnard, other nations moved to let brain death be used as an alternative measure of irreversible lifelessness, and soon heart transplants were being attempted all over, though nearly always with discouraging results. The main issue was an absence of a reliable immunosuppressive drug to deal with rejection of the new heart. Then, in 1969, an employee of the Swiss pharmaceutical company Sandoz named Henry Frey went on holiday in Norway and collected soil samples to take back to Sandoz labs. The company had always asked employees to do so when traveling in the hopes that they would find potentially new antibiotics. The sample contained a fungus which had no antibiotic properties but proved excellent at suppressing immune responses, just the thing needed to make organ transplants possible. Sandoz converted Frey's little bag of dirt into a best-selling medicine called cyclosporine. Thanks to it and technical improvements, by the early 1980s, transplant surgeons were managing success rates of 80%, an extraordinary achievement in a decade and a half. Today, the longest surviving transplant patient so far is John McCafferty, who lived 33 years with a transplanted heart before dying in 2016, aged 73. For the longest time, almost nothing was known of the purpose of blood, beyond that it was somehow vital to life. The prevailing theory, dating since the 2nd century by the venerable but frequently mistaken Greek physician Galen, was that life is manufactured continuously in the liver and used up by the body as fast as it was made. By the mid-1500s, the English physician William Harvey realized that blood is not endlessly consumed, but rather circulates in a closed system. In a landmark work called On the Motion of the Heart and Blood in Animals, Harvey outlined all the details of how the heart and circulatory system work in more or less the terms we understand today. This is always represented as one of those eureka moments that changed the world forever. In fact, in Harvey's day, the theory was almost universally ridiculed and rejected. The secret to circulation is respiration, and was figured out not long after Harvey's death by another Englishman named Richard Lower, a big insight that should have made him famous. In fact, Lower is remembered more now for another aspect of blood. Before an audience at the Royal Society in London, and without having any idea of what the consequences might be, Lower transfused about a half a pint of blood from a sheep into the arm of a volunteer named Arthur Koga. Then, Lower, Koga, and all the onlookers sat for many minutes waiting to see what would happen. Happily, nothing did, although normally, when foreign substances are introduced into the bloodstream, the recipient goes into shock, so why Koga escaped a miserable experience is puzzling. Unfortunately, the results emboldened other scientists across Europe to transfuse their volunteers with milk, wine, beer, even mercury, as well as the blood of every domesticated species. The result, all too often, were embarrassingly public deaths, and very quickly, transfusion experiments were banned, and for about a century and a half, they remained out of favor. And then, a strange thing followed. Just as the rest of the scientific world was embarking into the Age of Enlightenment, medicine sank into a kind of dark age. Consider the unfortunate death of George Washington. In December 1799, not long after he retired as America's first president, Washington returned home later than he expected and sat for dinner in wet clothing. That night, he developed a sore throat and soon had difficulty swallowing, and his breath became labored. 3 doctors were called in. What did they do? They opened up his vein and drained 18 ounces of blood. What might have been no more than a minor throat infection that required a little rest left Washington dead at 67 years old. It may seem foolish to us to bleed a person who is already severely ill, but such practices lasted an extraordinarily long time. Bleeding was thought to be beneficial, not just for illness, but also to instill calm. The most celebrated bleeder of all was the American doctor Benjamin Rush. Rush was a conscientious and learned man. He was a signer of the Declaration of Independence and most eminent medical practitioner of his day in the New World. But he was a super enthusiast for bleeding. Rush drained up to 80 ounces at a time from his victims and sometimes bled them 2 or 3 times in a single day. In 1813, at the age of 67, he developed a fever, and when it didn't improve, he urged the attending physician to bleed him, and when they did, he died. And finally, the kidneys, which are invariably called the workhorses of the body. Each day, they process 190 quarts of water, that is about the amount of a bath, and 3.5 pounds of salt. Like the heart, they are surprisingly small for the amount of work they do, weighing just 5 ounces each. Filtering waste is their principal function, but they also regulate blood chemistry, help maintain blood pressure, and maintain the vital balance between salt and water levels within the body. The problem is that if you ask the kidney to do too much filtering over too long, they get tired and stop functioning well. As the kidneys become less efficient, the sodium levels in the blood creep up, pushing the blood pressure dangerously high. In December 1954, Richard Herrick was on the brink of death from a kidney failure at age 23. He was given his life back by becoming the world's first kidney transplant recipient. Herrick was exceedingly lucky because he had an identical twin, Ronald, a donor with a perfect tissue match. Even so, no one had ever attempted anything like this before, and his doctors weren't at all sure what the outcomes would be. As Dr. Joseph Murray, the lead surgeon, explained years later, none of us had ever asked a healthy person to accept this magnitude of risk solely for the sake of someone else. Happily, the outcome proved better than anyone dared hope. Indeed, Richard Herrick not only survived the operation, but gained his health. His brother Ronald lived another 56 years with his one kidney, and Dr. Joseph Murray was awarded Nobel Prize in Physiology or Medicine in 1990. Problems with rejection, however, meant that most other attempts at transplants failed. Over the following, it wasn't until the development of the miracle drug cyclosporine that we mentioned from a soil sample that Frey collected on a Norwegian holiday that transplants could start becoming